Anne's hands moved through the morning ritual without his mind taking much notice. Black coffee in that blue speckled tin cup, same chip on the rim that caught his thumb every blessed morning. Coffee grounds floating like dirt specks in standing water. But it was hot, and it was his. The cabin held its breath around him, quiet as a church on Monday. Sage whickered from the lean-to, getting impatient for her morning hay. At least one of them had somewhere to be, something that mattered. He scraped the last of yesterday's beans from that dented can, ate them standing by the cold stove, watching dust motes dance in the shaft of sunlight coming through his one window. 3 letters sat on the plank table. Kansas postmarks. Everyone. His sister Mary's careful handwriting getting more desperate with each envelope. Red wax seals staring at him like accusing eyes. Another day. Sage, he said, and his voice cracked from not being used much. Even 2 words felt strange, rolling off his tongue. The mare stamped her feet, understanding or impatient. Hard to tell the difference anymore. Outside. The desert stretched to every horizon you could name. Empty as a banker's heart. His 800 acres of scrub brush and alkali flats. Bought with his mustering out pay and the bitter taste of promises broken. Far enough from town that visitors gave up before the second ridge. Close enough to the spring that he wouldn't die of thirst. Yet, anyhow, he checked that Winchester above the door. Loaded, clean, ready for whatever might come calling. Apache hadn't raided this country in 2 years, and rustlers found nothing worth stealing on his spread. But habits die hard, and some habits are what keep a man breathing. The fence needed work always did in this country. Wind and time and the occasional cougar working together to tear down what a man builds with his own 2 hands. Anne pulled on his leather chaps, scarred up good from countless meetings with mesquite thorns and bridled sage. Water first, girl, he told her. Then we'll see how many posts the winter broke this time. The ride to the spring took him through country that would have broken most folks' hearts. Not pretty, not green, not gentle by any stretch, but honest. By God. The desert doesn't lie to you or promise what it can't deliver. Rain means flash floods. Sun means scorching heat. Wind means dust that gets in your teeth and stays there for a week. Prairie dog towns dotted the flats. Those little critters standing guard on their dirt mounds, chittering warnings as horse and rider passed. Sage stepped careful around their holes. A broken leg out here meant a bullet and a long walk home carrying your saddle. The spring bubbled up from a crack in the sandstone, forming a pool barely 6 feet across before seeping away into the thirsty ground. Crystal clear water, cold as a winter morning, sweet as anything that ever touched a man's lips. His one blessing in this godforsaken stretch of creation. That water barrel beside his cabin was down to dregs and green scum. He'd been putting off this trip for 2 days, drinking coffee thick as mud and tasting like regret. Getting mighty low, girl. He dismounted, pulled the cork from his canvas water bag. Real low. Sage dropped her head to drink, stretching her neck long and grateful. The sound of her swallowing seemed loud as thunder in all that desert quiet. Now, you understand. An had good reason to keep to himself. He could have moved his cabin closer to the spring, set up right there where life pooled and flourished. But that would mean folks might find him travelers, prospectors, anyone following the old Indian trails. The spring drew visitors like honey draws flies. Better to haul water than explanations, he reckoned. Before we continue, I'd love to know which city you're watching from. Let's get back to the story. The woman lay crumpled beneath the mesquite like cast-off clothing. Her deerskin dress, once soft as butter, hung stiff with dried sweat and desert dust. That silver bracelet caught the sun in sharp flashes as her chest rose and fell in shallow, desperate pulls. Apache. An's breath caught in his throat. His hand tightened on the water bag until the canvas creaked like old leather. Sage stepped closer, lowering her head to sniff the woman's outstretched hand. No fear in the mare's movements. Animals know things folks have forgotten, he reckoned. The woman's lips were split and white with alkali dust. Her hair hung in dark ropes across a face burned raw by desert sun. Young, maybe 25. Old enough to know better than to be out here alone. Old enough to be dead already. Should be dead already. Sweet Lord, he whispered, the words slipping out before he could stop them. Her eyelids fluttered at his voice. Dark eyes opened, focused on nothing first, then found his face. She tried to speak, only came out as a rasp, like wind through dried grass. Water, the word formed on her cracked lips without sound. But he read it clear as print on Sunday paper. His daddy's voice echoed in his skull. Never leave anything to die if you can help it, son. Man or beast, don't matter none. Life's too precious to waste. His daddy who'd died with a Comanche lance through his ribs. His daddy who'd preached mercy and got killed for it. The woman's eyes stayed fixed on that water bag. Her tongue, thick and gray as old leather, worked against her lower lip. Apache had raided through this country 2 summers back, burned the Hendricks place, ran off their cattle, left old man Hendricks staked out in the sun with his eyelids cut clean off. The territorial governor still had bounties posted, $25 for a warrior's scalp, $15 for a woman's, this woman's. Her hand moved, fingers opening and closing like a baby reaching for something that ain't there. Anne pulled the cork from his water bag. It came free with a soft pop. Sweet spring water sloshed inside, more precious than gold in this bone-dry country. He could mount up right now, ride away. Tell himself he'd seen nothing but heat shimmer and his own guilty conscience. By tomorrow, the buzzards would clean up the evidence. By next week, the desert would scatter her bones like thrown dice. Nobody would know. Nobody would blame him. The woman's breath rattled in her throat. Her eyes stayed locked on his face, not pleading, not demanding, just watching, waiting for him to choose what kind of man he really was. An knelt beside her in the shade of that mesquite, cupped his palm and tipped water into it, watching it pool in the hollow of his weathered hand. The first drops touched her lips, and her whole body shuddered like she'd been struck by lightning. But even as water trickled past her cracked lips, even as her throat worked to swallow, one thought hammered in his brain like a nail being driven deep. What incarnation have I just done? Sleep wouldn't come. An lay on his corn-shuck mattress, listening to every creak of settling timber, every whisper of wind through the cabin's chinked walls. That Winchester leaned against the bed frame, close enough to grab without thinking. His Colt hung from the bedpost, loaded chambers waiting. The woman's eyes haunted him, not grateful eyes, not soft, hard as flint and twice as sharp, watching him pour life back into her drop by precious drop. He'd rigged shade with his saddle blanket, stretching it between mesquite branches like his daddy taught him during the war. Given her half his jerky tough as boot leather, but better than dying. Stayed until she could sit upright. Back against that sandstone, silver bracelet catching light as she raised the water bag to her lips with shaking hands. "Ahehe," she'd whispered. "Thank you," in her tongue. The only Apache word he knew, learned from a cavalry scout who'd taken 2 arrows in the chest and lived to brag about it in every saloon from here to Tucson. She'd be gone come morning. Apache don't linger where they ain't wanted. Question was how many others knew where to find her. Moonlight slanted through his single window, casting the cabin in silver and black like an old tintype photograph. His coffee pot sat cold on the stove. Those 3 letters from Kansas lay unopened on the table, wax seals intact as the day they arrived. Mary's handwriting getting more desperate with each envelope. Come home. Oh, please, brother. There's nothing left for you out there. Nothing left anywhere, sister. That was the whole point. A coyote yipped somewhere in the darkness. Another answered from the ridge. Normal sounds. Desert sounds. Nothing to set his teeth on edge. But his hands wouldn't quit shaking. Dawn broke gray and cold like it always did in this country. Anne's coffee tasted like dirt in his mouth, black liquid bitter as his thoughts, grounds floating like sediment in a stagnant pond. He saddled Sage with movements grown automatic over 3 years of talking only to himself and his horse. Leather creaking, bit jingling, the mare's warm breath misting in the morning air. The ride to the spring stretched longer than usual. Every shadow could hide watching eyes. Every rock outcrop might conceal a rifle barrel. Apache moved through this country like ghosts, there and gone before a man could blink twice. But the spring lay empty when he reached it. No woman in deerskin dress, no silver bracelet catching sunlight. Just clear water bubbling up from that sandstone crack, indifferent as death to human troubles. The impression of her body remained in the sand where she'd lain. Shallow depression, human-shaped, already blurring at the edges where wind had begun its patient work of erasure. Something else caught his eye. A small bundle near the mesquite roots, wrapped in worked deerskin soft as a woman's palm. On dismounted, knelt beside it. The leather ties came away easy in his fingers. Inside blue cornmeal, ground fine as flour, sacred to the Apache people. Payment for water freely given, recognition of debt and honor. His hands shook as he hefted that little pouch, light as a feather, heavy as stones. She'd watched him pour life into her cupped palm, seen his face, memorized every line and scar, known his scent, his horse, his voice speaking that single word in the desert quiet. Apache have long memories, longer than most white men's lives. On remounted Sage. That medicine bundle clutched tight in his fist. The mare's ears worked forward and back, sensing his unease like animals do. The desert stretched empty in every direction you could name. But emptiness was a lie out here. Eyes watched from hidden places. Voices carried news across vast distances. The woman he'd saved would speak his name in the Apache tongue, would tell of kindness given when death seemed certain. And they would remember every word. The question hammering in his skull as he rode home wasn't whether they would come calling. The question was how many, and how soon, and whether he'd live long enough to regret choosing mercy over common sense. 3 days passed like held breath. On worked his fence line with hands that fumbled simple knots he'd tied 1,000 times before. Every snapped wire, every rotted post seemed to mock him. The desert had patience it could wait for a man to make his mistakes. His cattle bunched tight in the pasture instead of spreading out to graze like they ought. 23 head of scrawny longhorns, worth maybe $8 each if he could get them to market alive. They stood shoulder to shoulder, heads up, nostrils flaring at scents he couldn't catch. Something had them spooked proper. Sage whickered from her stall as he approached with the morning hay. Her ears worked like telegraph signals, swiveling toward sounds beyond what human ears could pick up. The mare had Apache blood in her lines, desert-bred, desert-wise. She knew things. "What is it, girl?" She sidled away from his touch. Normally steady hooves dancing on packed earth. White showed around her dark eyes like it did when thunder was building. An's coffee that morning tasted like copper pennies. His hands shook as he counted cartridges from the wooden box on his shelf. 43 rounds for the Winchester, 18 for the Colt, enough for a decent accounting of himself. If it came to shooting, that blue cornmeal sat on his table in its deerskin pouch, right next to Mary's unopened letters. Sacred meal. Ground by Apache hands. Blessed by Apache prayers. Payment for water given. Recognition of honor and debt. He should have thrown it away, scattered it to the four winds. Instead, he'd kept it close. Proof that he'd chosen mercy over wisdom. Evidence of his own fool heart. The sun climbed toward its daily torment, baking the desert floor until the air danced with heat shimmer. On mucked Sage's stall with movements gone mechanical, manure fork scraping against packed earth. Sweat ran down his ribs, soaking his cotton shirt till it clung like a second skin. The fork froze in his hands. Hoofbeats, distant but clear as church bells on Sunday morning. Multiple horses moving at an easy lope. Iron shoes ringing against stone in rhythm, not the random scatter of wild mustangs. This was controlled movement, purposeful, military. Sage threw her head up, ears pricked sharp toward the ridge. Her nostrils flared wide, reading messages written on the desert wind. An dropped the fork and grabbed his Winchester from where it leaned against the stall post. The lever worked smooth as silk, chambering around with a metallic snick that seemed loud as thunder in the desert quiet. His boots crunched on scattered hay as he moved to the lean-to opening. Each step echoed off the canyon walls, announcing his presence to anything with ears to hear. The hoofbeats came from three directions now: north, east, south, converging on his little spread like fingers of a closing fist. Through the shimmer of heat waves, he counted dust plumes against the horizon. 1, 2, 4 riders from the North Ridge, 3 more coming up the eastern draw. Another group approaching from the low hills to the south. More than a dozen horses, moving with the coordination of seasoned cavalry. Except no cavalry wore eagle feathers in their hair or painted their faces for what was coming. An's mouth went dry as alkali dust. His tongue worked against his teeth, seeking moisture that wasn't there. They'd surrounded him some time before dawn. Most likely. Moved into position like pieces on a checkerboard. Patient as stones, waiting for full light to make their presence known. Professional, disciplined, Apache. The Winchester felt light as a willow switch in his hands. Useless against numbers like these. His 43 rounds might drop 5, maybe 6 if his aim held steady. His aim. The rest would swarm him like wolves on a wounded elk. The cattle had stopped their nervous lowing. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Sage backed deeper into her stall, ears flat against her skull. Her hooves struck the wooden partition with sharp cracks that echoed like gunshots. From the North Ridge, a single rider appeared above the heat shimmer. Paint horse marked with white handprints, moving at a deliberate walk down the rocky slope. The rider sat straight-backed and easy in his saddle, rifle held across his thighs but not aimed. Not yet. Other riders emerged from cover on the eastern and southern approaches. Their movements synchronized like dancers responding to music only they could hear. An's breathing came shallow and quick. Sweat stung his eyes, blurred his vision. The rifle barrel wavered as his hands began to shake in earnest. 12 riders, maybe more still hidden in the rocks. All of them converging on his cabin with the patience of men who knew their quarry had nowhere left to run. The question hammering in his brain wasn't how many there were. The question was whether he had enough bullets. They materialized from the desert like spirits taking flesh and bone. One moment the landscape lay empty, except for creosote and sage. The next 12 Apache warriors sat their horses in a perfect circle around his cabin, rifles glinting in the harsh sun. No war cries, no whooping. Just the quiet discipline of men who'd learned their trade in blood and sand. An's knuckles went white around the Winchester's stock. His heart hammered against his ribs, loud enough that he wondered if they could hear it across the dusty distance. The leader rode a paint horse marked with white handprints, symbols of enemies killed in battle, each print earned with another man's life. Silver gleamed in his braided hair, catching light with each movement of his weathered head. Maybe 50 years old, with the face of a man who'd seen too much and forgotten none of it. His rifle lay across his thighs, ready but not threatening. Yet. The other warriors flanked him in careful formation. Young men mostly, lean and hard as whipcord. Their horses trained to stand motionless as carved statues. Paint streaked their faces red ochre, white clay, charcoal black, war paint, but worn with ceremony rather than rage. Bone breastplates caught the sun. Eagle feathers stirred in the hot breeze. Beadwork on their moccasins told stories On couldn't read but understood anyway. These weren't raiders or renegades looking for easy pickings. These were the Apache version of dress uniforms. His mouth tasted like copper pennies. Sweat ran down his spine, soaking his shirt until it clung to his skin like wet canvas. The Winchester's trigger guard was slick beneath his finger. Movement on his left drew his attention. Another rider approached from the eastern draw, moving at an easy walk. This one different from the others. A woman. Recognition hit him like a physical blow to the chest. The same dark hair, now braided with silver ornaments that caught the light. The same silver bracelet on her wrist, flashing as she controlled her spotted mare with one hand. But everything else transformed. 3 days ago, she'd lain dying in the sand. Lips cracked white, skin burned raw by desert sun. Now she sat her horse with the easy grace of someone born to the saddle, raised on horseback before she could walk proper. Her deerskin dress had been replaced by ceremonial clothing, soft leather, decorated with elk teeth and geometric beadwork that caught the light like captured stars. Turquoise and silver hung at her throat, worked into patterns that spoke of skill and wealth. She was beautiful. Not the desperate, dying creature he'd found beneath the mesquite, but a woman in her prime, vital and strong as desert ironwood. She rode through the circle of warriors without hesitation, taking her place beside the leader, not as a captive or protected thing, but as an equal. Her dark eyes found On across the dusty space between them. And something passed in that look. Recognition, memory, acknowledgement of debt. The leader spoke, his voice carrying across the desert air like distant thunder. Apache words, musical and flowing like water over stones, rising and falling in cadences that painted pictures in the mind. The woman listened, nodding once with the gravity of someone hearing testimony in a court of law. She dismounted with fluid grace, her moccasined feet silent on the packed earth, started walking toward his cabin with measured steps, hands open at her sides, palms visible. On's breathing came quick and shallow. The rifle barrel wavered as his hands shook. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat into the cabin. Barricade the door, make them come to him through the narrow opening. But something in her approach held him motionless. No threat in her movements, no weapon in her hands. Just a woman walking across open ground toward a man who'd given her water when she was dying under the desert sun. 20 yards away now, close enough to see the intricate beadwork on her dress, the silver ornaments braided into her hair like small moons. Close enough to see the intelligence in those dark eyes, the careful way she moved to show she meant no harm. She stopped 10 feet from the lean-to opening, raised her right hand, palm out, in the universal gesture of peace. Then she spoke, and her voice carried clearly in the desert stillness. I told them about the water. English. Careful and precise, with only the faintest accent coloring the words like smoke from a distant fire. On's finger tightened on the trigger. Behind her, the circle of warriors sat motionless as bronze statues, waiting to see what would unfold in this moment that might determine whether blood flowed or mercy prevailed. Her next words hit him like a physical blow. They want to know why you helped me. The desert went quiet, except for the sound of his own ragged breathing and the distant cry of a hawk circling high overhead. Why indeed? Anne's throat closed tight as rawhide left in the sun. The Winchester trembled in his grip, barrel wavering between the woman and the circle of mounted warriors behind her. "Why I helped you." The words came out as a croak, like he hadn't spoken in weeks. She nodded, dark eyes never leaving his face. "You could have ridden away. White men usually do." Behind her, the leader's paint horse stamped once, silver conchos on its bridle jingling like wind chimes. The sound carried sharp and clear in the desert stillness. The only movement in a world gone still as death. An's mouth worked, seeking words that wouldn't come. Truth sat heavy in his chest, like swallowed stones. Because his daddy taught him never to leave anything to die if he could help it. Because her eyes reminded him of his own when he looked in the mirror hollow, used up, hanging on to life by the thinnest thread. Because 3 years of talking only to his horse had hollowed him out, until even an Apache woman's life mattered more than his own safety. "Seemed the right thing," he managed, voice barely above a whisper. The woman tilted her head, studying him like a hawk studies a rabbit in the grass. "Right thing? Yes." She turned slightly, spoke over her shoulder in Apache. The musical words flowed like creek water, rise and fall, pauses and emphasis that painted pictures in the air. The leader listened without moving a muscle. His weathered face revealed nothing, carved from desert stone and just as readable. She turned back to An. "I told them you gave water when I was dying. Stayed until I could sit. Left jerky wrapped in oilcloth." Her hand moved to touch something at her throat, a small pouch hanging from a sinew cord. "I told them you spoke no threats, asked for nothing in return." Sweat ran into An's eyes, stinging salt that blurred his vision. His finger ached from pressing against the trigger guard. The rifle felt heavy as an anvil in his shaking hands. "I told them you could have taken other things." Her voice dropped lower, forcing him to strain to hear. "Hair. Scalp. Things white men sell for bounty money at the territorial office." The words hit him like physical blows. $25 for a warrior's scalp, 15 for a woman's. Posted right there on the territorial governor's bulletin board. Payment guaranteed by the territorial treasury. Blood money. Legal as Sunday service. "Didn't occur to me," he said, and meant it. She smiled then, and the expression transformed her face completely. Not the desperate, dying creature from the mesquite thicket. Not even the composed woman who'd ridden with the warriors. Something warmer. Human. "I know," she said. "That's why they came." Behind her, one of the younger warriors shifted in his saddle, his horse sidled, hooves scraping against stone. The sound echoed off the canyon walls like distant gunfire. The woman raised her right hand, palm over her heart. Spoke in Apache, her voice carrying the cadence of ceremony. Formal words, weighted with significance that pressed against the air itself. The leader responded, his voice rolling like distant thunder across the desert floor. Other warriors nodded. A ripple of agreement moving through the circle like wind through wheat. "What's he saying?" Anne's voice cracked like a boy's. She looked back at him, those dark eyes holding depths he couldn't fathom. "He says there are two kinds of white men in this territory. Those who see Apache as animals to be hunted for profit, and those who see Apache as people to be helped when they're dying." The leader spoke again, shorter this time, sharp consonants cutting the air like knife blades. "He wants to know which kind you are." An's breathing came shallow and quick. The desert spun around him. heat waves rising from baked earth until the world wavered like water. His legs felt weak as green timber. "I reckon I just gave you water," he whispered. "Yes." She nodded slowly. "But why? What did you hope to gain?" The question hung in the air between them like smoke from a distant fire. Behind her, 12 Apache warriors sat motionless on their horses, weapons ready but not raised. Waiting for his answer like judges waiting for a verdict. The truth was simple, terrible, and simple. "Because you were dying. And I ain't the kind of man who can watch something die without trying to help." She translated his words into Apache, her voice carrying clearly to the mounted men. The leader's expression shifted slightly, not a smile, but something warmer than the stone mask he'd worn before. He spoke again, longer this time. Musical words that rose and fell like wind through canyon walls, carrying weight and authority older than territorial governments. The woman's eyes widened. She looked back at An with something that might have been surprise. "What?" he asked. "He says the Apache have a law. A man who saves a life owes nothing to anyone. But the person whose life was saved—" She paused, choosing her words with the care of someone walking on thin ice. "Owes everything to the one who saved them." The leader raised his staff eagle feathers bound to carved wood with sinew and ceremony, and spoke once more. His voice carried the authority of ages, the weight of tradition older than white men's presence in this harsh land. When he finished, the woman turned back to An with an expression he couldn't read. "What did he say?" "He said you are under Apache protection now. Any man who harms you will answer to us." The words hit him like cold water in his face. Protection. From the very people he'd expected to kill him. But something in her tone, something in the way the warriors' hands moved closer to their weapons, told him there was more to it than that. "What else?" She met his eyes directly, and for the first time since she'd begun speaking, her voice carried uncertainty. "He said that protection begins now, today. But first—" She gestured toward the circle of mounted warriors. "You must prove you are worthy of Apache protection." The desert went quiet except for the sound of his own ragged breathing and the creak of leather as horses shifted their weight. "How do I do that?" Her answer made his blood run cold. "You must choose between your people and ours." The woman's eyes held something An couldn't name. Not pity, not mockery. Something harder to bear than either. "You must walk to him," she said, nodding toward the leader on the painted horse. "Unarmed." An's grip on the Winchester tightened until his knuckles cracked like dry kindling. "Walk to him. Without your rifle. Without your pistol." Her voice stayed level, matter of fact, as if she were discussing the weather or the price of cattle. "If you are truly worthy of Apache protection, you will trust Apache judgment." The desert floor seemed to tilt beneath his feet like the deck of a ship in rough water. 12 warriors in a perfect circle, rifles ready. Their leader watching him with eyes like flint chips struck from stone, all waiting to see if he'd choose courage over the cowardice that had kept him alive these past 3 years. His daddy's voice echoed in his skull. "Sometimes a man's got to walk toward what scares him most, son." But his daddy died with a Comanche lance through his ribs for trusting the wrong people. "And if I ain't worthy?" The woman's expression didn't change by so much as the flicker of an eyelid. "Then you die quickly, with honor." Sweat ran down his spine in cold rivulets despite the desert heat. The Winchester felt slick in his palms, familiar weight that had kept him breathing through 3 years of solitude and longer nights. His Colt rode heavy on his hip, loaded cylinder ready to speak in lead and powder smoke. Both weapons useless against numbers like these, might as well be carrying sticks and stones against a lightning storm. How do I know this ain't some kind of trap? You don't. She stepped aside, clearing a path between him and the mounted leader. But you gave water to a dying Apache woman, when you could have taken her scalp for $15 bounty money. That was also a choice without knowing what would come of it. The leader spoke again, his voice carrying the authority of granite and steel forged in desert fire. The woman listened, nodded once with the gravity of someone hearing final judgment. He says a man who must think too long about courage doesn't have any to begin with. Heat flooded On's face like he'd opened an oven door. Shame tasted like copper pennies on his tongue, bitter as wormwood. 3 years of hiding from the world. 3 years of talking only to his horse. 3 years of letting letters from his sister gather dust while he nursed his wounds like a whipped cur licking its belly. Maybe the Apache leader was right. Maybe he was nothing but a coward after all. His hands shook as he leaned the Winchester against the lean-to post. The metal barrel rang against wood like a funeral bell. The Colt's weight left his hip, gun belt dropping to the dirt with a soft thump that sounded loud as thunder in his ears. Standing there in his sweat-stained shirt and canvas pants, he felt naked as a newborn colt, defenseless as a child. The woman nodded approval. Walk straight to him. Stop when he raises his hand. Do not speak unless he speaks first. This is Apache law. On's boots crunched on scattered gravel. Each step carried him farther from the safety of his weapons, closer to the circle of mounted warriors. Their faces revealed nothing bronze masks carved by desert wind and shaped by generations of warfare. The leader sat motionless on his painted horse, staff held upright, eagle feathers stirring in the hot breeze. Silver conchos on his bridle caught sunlight like distant stars in a dark sky. 20 yards. 15. Close enough to see the red ochre painted across his cheekbones. The deep lines carved around his eyes by decades of squinting into desert glare and measuring the worth of men. 10 yards. The staff rose, stopping On in his tracks like an invisible wall. The leader spoke, words flowing like water over stones, musical cadences that carried meanings beyond mere language. The woman's voice followed, translating, "He says you show courage by coming unarmed, but courage alone is not enough to earn Apache protection." On's throat worked, seeking moisture that wasn't there. What else does he want from me? More Apache words, these sharper, more demanding, the sound of final judgment being rendered. He wants to know if you understand the weight of Apache protection, what it means, what it costs a man's soul. The painted horse shifted, hooves scraping against stone. The sound echoed off canyon walls like distant thunder promising rain that might never come. I don't rightly understand. The leader leaned forward in his saddle, fixing On with eyes that seemed to look straight through flesh and bone to whatever was left of his soul. When he spoke again, his voice carried the weight of absolute authority earned through blood and survival. The woman translated without emotion. He says if you accept Apache protection, you accept Apache law. If someone threatens you, they threaten the Apache people. If you betray that trust. She paused, choosing words with the care of someone handling sharp blades. There is no place in all the territories where you could hide from Apache justice. On's mouth went dry as alkali dust. Protection that came with iron chains attached. Safety that demanded absolute loyalty in return, unto death. And if I refuse his offer? The leader spoke again, shorter this time, final as a coffin lid closing. Then you are still safe, today, because you gave water when water meant life. The woman's dark eyes found his across the dusty space. But only today. Tomorrow, you are just another white man in Apache country. The desert held its breath around them. Somewhere in the distance, a buzzard circled on motionless wings, waiting for something to die so it could feast. An looked at the circle of mounted warriors, their weapons ready, their faces unreadable as carved stone. Looked at the woman who'd been dying 3 days ago, and now stood translated between two worlds. Looked at the leader whose painted horse bore the white handprints of enemies killed in honorable combat. His choice, when it came down to brass tacks, was simple as Sunday scripture. Live alone and die alone, the way he'd been doing, or trust in something larger than his own fear and cowardice. He opened his mouth to speak his choice, and the leader's staff moved again, not raised this time, but pointed like an accusation, behind An, toward the northern ridge where dust clouds boiled against the horizon like smoke from a grass fire. New riders approaching, moving fast and hard. The woman's voice carried a tension sharp as a blade. White men, many of them, coming with purpose. An turned to look, and his heart sank like a stone thrown into deep water. Territorial marshal's badge glinting in the sun. 5 men riding hard behind him, all armed and looking for blood. Now he'd have to choose sides whether he wanted to or not. The dust cloud on the northern ridge moved wrong. Too fast for cattle, too organized for wild mustangs. Anne counted the shapes emerging from the heat shimmers, 6 riders pushing their mounts hard down the rocky slope, leaving trails of dust and scattered stone. White men, armed and moving with the kind of purpose that meant trouble for somebody. The Apache leader's staff swung toward An, then back toward his warriors. Sharp words in their tongue, commands that needed no translation. The circle began to tighten, horses stepping sideways with trained precision. What's happening? An's voice came out as a whisper. The woman's eyes stayed fixed on the approaching riders, her hand moving instinctively to the knife at her belt. Bounty hunters, maybe, or territorial law. Her voice carried the weight of experience. They've been tracking us. The lead rider crested the ridge, spurring his horse down the treacherous slope with reckless speed that spoke of desperation or duty. Close enough now to make out details: wide-brimmed hat, rifle across his saddle, the glint of something metallic on his vest. A badge, territorial marshal, which meant the others were his posse, deputized and legal as Sunday service. An's heart hammered against his ribs like it was trying to break free. His weapons lay 20 feet away, leaning against the lean-to post. Might as well be 20 miles for all the good they'd do him now. The marshal's voice carried across the desert air, harsh and commanding. You there, step away from them Indians. The Apache warriors shifted, rifles rising to ready positions. Not aimed yet, but the threat clear as desert lightning. 12 against 6, but the 6 had the law on their side and blood in their eyes. An stood frozen in the space between two worlds. Behind him, 12 Apache warriors prepared to fight and die. Ahead, 6 white men riding hard with territorial authority backing their play. I said, step away. The marshal's horse slid to a stop 50 yards out, lather white on its neck, sides heaving. Those are hostile Apache. Get clear and we'll handle this proper. The woman took a step closer to An, not seeking protection but offering it. Her voice dropped low, urgent. Choose now. Walk to them, or walk to us. No more time for thinking. The marshal raised his rifle, iron barrel glinting in the harsh sun. His men spread out in a ragged line, weapons ready. The math was simple and brutal, 6 against 12. But the 12 were surrounded and caught in the open. Last warning, the marshal shouted, his voice cracking with authority and heat. Step clear, or we'll consider you hostile too. An's legs felt weak as green timber. Sweat stung his eyes, blurred the world into heat shimmer and moving shapes. His throat burned with each breath of superheated air. The easy choice lay 20 feet away. walk to his weapons, grab them, stand with his own kind. White men with badges and the territorial government behind them, men who looked like him, talked like him, shared his blood and his God, the safe choice, the expected choice, the choice any reasonable man would make. The Apache leader spoke, his voice carrying calm authority despite the rifles pointed at his men. The woman translated without taking her eyes off the approaching posse. He says you must decide what kind of man you are. Now. Today. No more time for considering all the angles. One of the marshal's men fired a warning shot into the air. The crack echoed off canyon walls, sharp as breaking bone. Horses danced, men cursed. The desert air grew thick with the smell of burned powder and fear. "Next one goes center mass," the marshal yelled, working his rifle bolt. "Clear out now." An looked at the woman beside him. 3 days ago she'd been dying under a mesquite tree, lips cracked white, hand reaching for water that would save her life. He'd made a choice then without thinking, poured precious water into cupped palms because it seemed right, because she was dying, and he was human. And that ought to count for something in this godforsaken world. The marshal's rifle swung toward him, black muzzle like a watching eye. "You deaf? Mister, I said, clear out." An's daddy's voice whispered in his memory. "Sometimes doing right ain't the same as doing safe, son. But a man's got to live with the choices he makes, and he's got to sleep with his conscience every night till he dies." His daddy who died for showing mercy to the wrong people at the wrong time. His daddy who'd raised him to believe that water shared with the dying was never wasted, no matter who was doing the dying. An took a step toward the Apache circle, then another. His boots crunched on gravel, loud as gunshots in the desert quiet. "You stupid fool!" the marshal screamed, his voice going high and thin. "Get back here!" But An kept walking, each step carrying him farther from the world of badges and bounties, closer to something he couldn't name but recognized in his bones. The Apache leader watched him approach, painted face revealing nothing. 20 feet became 15. 15 became 10. The leader's staff dropped, pointing at the ground beside his painted horse. An stopped there, unarmed and exposed, standing with people who should have been his enemies. The woman moved to his right side, the Apache leader to his left. The marshal's voice cracked with rage and disbelief. "So be it, you made your choice. You damn fool, rifle bolts worked, chambering rounds with metallic clicks that sounded like death knocking at the door. 6 barrels swung toward the Apache circle, toward the white man who'd chosen the wrong side. But the Apache leader raised his staff high, eagle feathers catching the wind, and spoke words that rang across the desert like a bell tolling judgment. The woman's translation came steady and clear. "He says you are under Apache protection now. Any harm that comes to you comes to all of us. Apache law." The marshal's face went purple with fury and heat. "That's aiding hostiles, that's treason against the territorial government." The Apache leader smiled then, and the expression was terrible to see, not cruel, but final as winter frost. He spoke again, and this time An didn't need translation to understand the threat in those musical words. But what came next made his blood run cold as mountain snow. From the eastern ridge, more dust clouds appeared. Then from the south, the west, Apache warriors, scores of them, rising from the desert like spirits taking flesh. The marshal's posse found themselves surrounded by what looked like half the Apache nation, and somewhere in the distance, the sound of a bugle carried on the wind. Cavalry, coming fast. Warriors rose from the landscape like heat mirages taking solid form. Not dozens, scores of them. Apache fighters who'd been lying motionless in the creosote and sage, invisible until they chose to be seen. The marshal's rifle wavered as he counted the odds. 6 white men against what looked like half the Apache nation. His horse sidled beneath him, nostrils flaring at the scent of too many predators. "Sweet Jesus," one of his men whispered. The Apache leader spoke, his voice carrying the authority of stone and steel. Words that needed no translation: surrender or die where you sit. The woman beside An translated anyway. "He says the marshal and his men may leave, now, while they still draw breath." The marshal's face flushed red as raw beef. "I got warrants, territorial authority." "You have nothing here," the woman said, her voice calm as still water. "This is Apache land, Apache law." The leader spoke again, sharper this time, final as a coffin nail. "He says your authority ends where Apache rifles begin." The woman's voice carried no threat, just simple fact. "Take your men and go. Don't come back to this place." Warriors on the ridges shifted, sunlight catching on rifle barrels and lance points. The marshal's posse sat their horses like men watching their own graves being dug with their names already carved on the headstones. "This ain't over," the marshal said. But his rifle was already dropping toward his saddle horn. "Washington will hear about this." The Apache leader smiled, and the expression held no warmth whatsoever. "Washington is very far away," the woman said. The marshal wheeled his horse around, spurring hard up the rocky slope. His men followed, riding like the devil himself was on their heels with a hot poker. The dust of their passage settled slowly in the desert heat. Apache warriors began disappearing back into the landscape as quietly as they'd appeared, melting into creosote and sage until only the original 12 remained. An's legs felt weak as water. He'd stood with Apache against his own people, and lived to see the sun still burning overhead. The leader dismounted from his painted horse, staff in his right hand. He was shorter than An had expected, but carried himself with the dignity of kings and the authority of men who'd earned their place through blood and wisdom. He spoke, musical words that rose and fell like wind through canyon walls. "He says you chose well," the woman translated. "Few white men would stand with Apache against their own kind." "Seemed the right thing to do," An managed, his voice hoarse as desert wind. The leader smiled genuine this time, not the terrible expression he'd shown the marshal. He handed his staff to one of the younger warriors and stepped forward, offering his hand in the white man's custom. An took it. The leader's grip was firm, calloused from a lifetime of hard living under an unforgiving sun. When he spoke again, the woman's translation came soft with respect. "He says you are no longer alone in this desert. Apache eyes will watch your land. Apache warriors will guard your sleep. Any who threaten you threaten us all." The handshake lasted longer than necessary, a bond being forged in flesh and promise, sealed by choices made when the chips were down. When the leader released his grip, he spoke to the woman. She nodded, walked to her spotted mare, and returned with a bundle wrapped in worked deerskin. "Medicine bundle," she explained, placing it in An's hands. "Sage and sweetgrass, cedar and tobacco, to keep evil spirits away from your home and heart." The bundle felt warm in his palms, soft as a woman's touch. Sacred things, blessed by Apache prayers older than white men's presence in this harsh land. "Thank you." The words seemed inadequate for what had just passed between them. "Thank the water you gave freely when I was dying," she said. Everything else followed from that choice. The warriors began mounting their horses, preparing to leave like morning mist before the sun. But the leader spoke once more, his voice carrying across the desert like distant thunder, promising rain. "He has one last thing to tell you," the woman said. "What's that?" Her dark eyes held depths he was only beginning to understand. "He says the desert is no longer empty for you. We will always be watching, always be near. You are under our protection now, for as long as you live and breathe." The leader raised his staff in formal salute. The other warriors followed suit. A forest of weapons lifted toward the burning sky in recognition of a debt that could never be fully repaid. Then they were gone, riding away in all directions, scattering like seeds on the wind until the desert looked empty again. Only the woman remained. "Will I see you again?" An asked. She smiled, and for the first time since that day by the spring, it reached her eyes like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. "The desert has long memory, and Apache have longer." She mounted her spotted mare with fluid grace, gathered the reins in her hands. "Live well, water giver, live without fear." Her horse's hooves made no sound on the packed earth as she rode toward the western ridge. An watched until she disappeared into heat shimmer and dancing light. The desert fell quiet around him. But it was a different quiet now, not the silence of abandonment, but the hush of protective watching, the silence of belonging to something larger than himself. He walked to his lean-to, picked up his weapons. The Winchester felt lighter in his hands. The Colt's weight seemed less pressing on his hip. That evening, as he sat on his porch watching the sun sink toward the horizon like a red coal in God's own forge, An opened his first letter from Kansas. Mary's desperate handwriting, ink blurred by tears and time. "Come home, brother, please. There's nothing left for you in that wasteland." He looked out at the desert, his desert now, protected and watched over by eyes he couldn't see but knew were there. Maybe Mary was wrong about there being nothing left. Maybe he'd finally found something worth staying for. In the harsh desert of 1880s Arizona, we witnessed something profound: how a single act of kindness can transform not just individual lives, but entire communities. When An chose to give water to a dying Apache woman, he did more than save a life. He built a bridge across a chasm of mistrust and fear that had divided two peoples for generations. This story reminds us that compassion doesn't recognize the boundaries we draw between us and them. In our modern world, where division seems to deepen daily, An's choice offers timeless wisdom. He didn't help because it was safe or profitable or popular. He helped because another human being was suffering, and that ought to count for something. The Apache protection that followed wasn't just reward for kindness, it was recognition of shared humanity, in choosing to stand with those he was supposed to fear. An discovered that courage isn't the absence of fear, but acting with decency despite it. Sometimes the smallest gestures, a cup of water, a moment's mercy, can echo across generations. In a world that often rewards hardness, maybe our greatest strength lies in remaining tender enough to help a stranger in need. This is a work of fiction inspired by Western frontier stories, created solely for entertainment purposes. The story does not condone, encourage, or promote any form of violence or harmful behavior. All characters and events are products of the author's imagination, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental.